I was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your bones, making you feel like you're carrying the weight of the world. Another double shift at the diner, another night of barely making ends meet. But that was my life. Struggle was my constant companion. I was refilling coffee cups when I saw them. A well-dressed man, the kind who looked like money wasn't even a concept to him. It was just there. And with him was a little boy no older than 6, sitting in a wheelchair. The boy had deep, tired eyes, but there was something else. A quiet sadness, like he had already learned the world wouldn't make space for him. I wasn't supposed to care.
Just do my job.
But when I saw the father distracted by his phone, scrolling through emails while his son struggled to lift a spoon, something inside me twisted. He was struggling to eat, and no one cared. I didn't think twice. I walked over and gently knelt beside him. "Hey there," I said softly, lifting the spoon with a warm smile. "Need a little help?" The boy's hesitant eyes met mine. His father glanced up, a flicker of annoyance on his face, but I ignored him. Right now, it was just about the boy. He nodded shyly. So, I carefully fed him, making sure he was comfortable, making sure he felt like he mattered. And that was the moment his father truly saw me. The father put his phone down, his sharp blue eyes locking onto me. There was something unreadable in his gaze. Curiosity? Annoyance? Maybe even a touch of guilt. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice crisp, controlled. The kind of voice that came from power, from being used to giving orders. But I smiled at the little boy, who was now more relaxed, eating without struggle. "I know," I said. "But I want to." The billionaire watched me like I was some puzzle he couldn't quite figure out.
But the boy?
He was grinning now, laughing softly between bites. That was all that mattered. "Most people don't bother," he murmured, almost to himself. I shrugged. "Most people should." He stared at me like I'd just said something impossible. That was the first moment I realized this man had never been told no in his life. And yet, he didn't argue with me. He just watched. After I finished my shift, I stepped outside, stretching my aching back. But just as I pulled my jacket on, a sleek black car pulled up. The billionaire. He rolled down the window. "I want to talk to you," he said. I crossed my arms. "Pretty sure we already did." His lips twitched. Not quite a smile. More like fascination.
"Get in," he said.
Just for a minute. Every instinct screamed no. I'd seen enough rich men to know they never did anything for free. But then, from the back seat, a tiny voice called out his son. "Please." And that was how it started. I hesitated at the open car door. The billionaire, Nathaniel Cross, I later learned, watched me with something between intrigue and impatience, like a man who wasn't used to waiting for answers. But it was his son, Theo, who made the decision for me. "Please," Theo repeated, his little voice cutting through my defenses. I exhaled sharply. What was I getting myself into? Sliding into the sleek leather seat, I barely had time to process the luxury around me before Nathaniel spoke. "You work at that diner full-time?"
"Yeah."
"And before that?" "Different places." "Doesn't really matter." He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle. "You didn't hesitate to help Theo," he said. "Most people stare, pity him, ignore him. But you." I shrugged. I just did what felt right. Silence stretched between us. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "What if I asked you to work for me instead?" I laughed. A short, dry laugh. "You want to hire me?" "As what? A babysitter?" "Caregiver," he corrected. "Someone Theo actually responds to. He needs structure. Attention. And you." His gaze flickered unreadable. "You're different." I narrowed my eyes. "So, what? You just buy solutions to your problems?" For the first time, he looked slightly taken aback. Then, he smirked, an infuriatingly arrogant expression. "Yes," he admitted. I should have walked away right then. But when I looked at Theo, his hopeful eyes staring up at me, I couldn't. I sighed. "What's the catch?" Nathaniel leaned forward. "You move in. Full-time care. Name your salary."
"Move in?"
"Absolutely not." But then he named a figure. A ridiculous, life-changing number. My breath caught. I should say no. But God help me, I whispered. When do I start? Nathaniel's estate wasn't a mansion. It was a fortress. Guards at the gates. A driveway longer than some roads. Marble floors, towering ceilings, a glass wall overlooking the city skyline. And yet, it felt empty. Theo's room was enormous, but lonely. The kind of place designed with money, not love. As I tucked him into bed that night, he held my hand a little too tightly. You'll stay, right? He whispered. I should have lied. Instead, I told the truth. I don't know yet. His tiny fingers curled around mine. I hope you do. The next morning, Nathaniel was waiting for me in the dining room, dressed in an impeccable suit, sipping coffee like he ran the world, because, in a way, he did. You start today, he said. I arched a brow. I already started last night. A ghost of a smirk played on his lips, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. Theo's therapy schedule is strict. Follow it. I'll follow it, I said. If it actually helps him. His expression hardened. It does. Then why is he still struggling to eat? His jaw clenched. I had struck a nerve. Do your job, he said coldly. I'll handle the rest. I met his gaze head-on. That's the problem, Nathaniel. You're handling things. You're not actually being there.
For the first time, he had no response.
Over the next few weeks, I saw two sides of Nathaniel Cross. The ruthless businessman, cold, calculating, terrifyingly intelligent. And the father, who didn't know how to love. Theo clung to me like a lifeline. But every time Nathaniel tried to connect with his son, he failed. Not for lack of trying, he just didn't know how. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, he murmured, almost to himself, I don't know what he needs from me. And for the first time, I saw something terrifying in his eyes. Regret. It happened out of nowhere. Theo had a medical emergency. 1 second he was fine. The next he was struggling to breathe. Nathaniel's mask shattered. He grabbed his son, panic flashing across his face as he barked for the doctor. I held Theo's hand, whispering soothing words. But when I glanced up at Nathaniel, I saw something raw in his expression.
Fear.
For the first time, he wasn't in control. And it terrified him. The doctor stabilized Theo, but Nathaniel was shaken. That night, he knocked on my door. Not his usual commanding, arrogant self. Just a father who was afraid. What if I lose him? He whispered. I hesitated, then finally told him the truth. Then maybe it's time you stop trying to control everything and just be his dad. For the first time since I met him, he listened. Nathaniel Cross was not a man used to feeling powerless. He built his empire with cold efficiency, controlling every variable, eliminating every weakness.
But now?
His greatest weakness was his own son. Theo had barely left his room since the medical emergency. He was quiet, withdrawn. I knew the signs of a child retreating into themselves. And worse, so did Nathaniel. One evening, I found him standing outside Theo's door, hesitant. The powerful billionaire, too afraid to step inside. Talk to him, I urged. Nathaniel scoffed. You think I haven't tried? Maybe that's the problem. You're talking. You're not listening. He went silent. And then, for the first time, he knocked softly, entered his son's room, and truly tried. Theo didn't respond at first. He simply stared at the window, as if looking for an escape. Nathaniel sat beside him, stiff, unsure. I know you're mad at me, he finally said. I know I haven't been here the way you need. Theo didn't say a word. Nathaniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. I don't know how to do this, son. Still nothing. I watched from the doorway, heart aching. This man was trying, but his son had already learned not to expect much. Then, quietly, Theo whispered, I don't want to go away. Nathaniel stiffened. What? I heard you. You were going to send me to that school far away. Nathaniel's eyes widened in shock, then shame. His son had overheard everything. I don't want to leave. Theo's voice cracked. But I know you don't want me either. Nathaniel's entire world shattered. Nathaniel grabbed Theo's small hand, his grip shaking. That's not true, he whispered, voice hoarse. I thought I was doing what was best. Theo didn't pull away, but he didn't meet his father's gaze either. You never asked me, he said. The weight of those words nearly broke Nathaniel Cross. I turned away, giving them privacy. For the first time, he was truly facing what he had done. Later that night, Nathaniel found me in the hallway. He looked different. Not in his pristine suit, not exuding his usual untouchable arrogance. Just a man carrying unbearable guilt. How do I fix this? He asked. For once, he wasn't demanding. He was asking. I cross my arms. Start by being the dad he needs, not the businessman you are. His lips pressed together. And, I said, smirking, you let me help. He hesitated, then nodded. A truce. But in the shadows, someone else was watching. Nathaniel Cross had many enemies. But I never expected one to be inside his own home. That night, I overheard hushed whispers from the study. A voice I didn't recognize. He's weak now. Vulnerable, the man said. I peered inside, heart pounding. Nathaniel's right-hand man, Victor Hale, stood in the dim light, speaking on the phone. His expression was calculating. Dangerous. He cares about that boy too much, he continued. That makes him easy to control. Ice filled my veins. They were plotting something. And I was the only one who could stop it. I didn't sleep that night. The pieces were falling into place. Nathaniel had corporate enemies, and now, even the people closest to him were trying to use his son as leverage. Theo was in danger. I had to tell Nathaniel. But the man barely trusted me. Would he even believe me? I had no choice. The next morning, I stormed into his office. He barely glanced up. What is it? He asked. I didn't hesitate. Someone in your own company is planning to use Theo against you. His entire body went still. Then his icy blue eyes locked onto mine. Tell me everything. Nathaniel wasn't just angry. He was lethal. I told him everything I overheard. Every word. Every calculated threat. His face remained unreadable, but something dark flickered behind his gaze. This isn't just business, he murmured. This is personal. My stomach turned. Who's behind this? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. My own brother. I shouldn't have been shocked. Powerful men like Nathaniel always had snakes in their own bloodline. His brother, Andrew Cross, had been waiting in the shadows, biding his time. And now? He was coming for Theo. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his control slipping. He wants custody. He thinks he can prove I'm an unfit father. I felt sick. Can he? I whispered. Nathaniel looked at me, something fragile in his expression. If I don't change, yes. And suddenly, everything was different. Nathaniel paced in his office, fists clenched. His usual mask of control was slipping, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He filed already, he muttered, throwing a document onto the desk. Andrew isn't wasting time. I picked up the papers. Petition for emergency custody. My stomach churned. He's claiming child neglect? I read aloud. Nathaniel let out a harsh laugh. He's spinning the story, saying I don't care about Theo, that I don't spend time with him, that I'd rather ship him off than be a father. I swallowed hard because some of that had been true. Nathaniel must have seen it on my face because his expression darkened. You think he's right? He challenged. I met his gaze. I think you need to prove him wrong. Andrew wasn't just taking legal action. He was using media. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire neglects disabled son. Uncle seeks custody. Inside the Cross family feud, who's the better guardian? Nathaniel sat frozen at his desk, watching the news coverage. His name, his empire, was being dragged through the dirt. But what made him snap wasn't the reporters. It was Theo, sitting in the living room, watching the screen with wide, terrified eyes. Am I going away? Theo whispered. Nathaniel went pale. I saw something shift in him. Rage. Determination. A father who was finally ready to fight. He grabbed his jacket, jaw tight. We're going to fix this. For the company? I asked. He shook his head. For Theo. Nathaniel wasn't going to fight Andrew with money or power. He was going to fight him by becoming the father Theo needed. It started small. Mornings where he actually sat with Theo at breakfast instead of taking calls. Afternoons where he pushed the wheelchair instead of letting the staff do it. Evenings where he read to his son, despite being exhausted. Theo was hesitant at first. He didn't trust it. But little by little he started smiling again. "We have 2 weeks until the hearing," Nathaniel's lawyer warned. "The judge needs to see that you are actively involved in Theo's life, or Andrew will win." Nathaniel glanced at me. "What else can I do?" I crossed my arms. "You still treat Theo like he needs protection. Let him live a little." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "Let him be a kid, Nathaniel." That weekend, we took Theo to the park for the first time in years. And when Nathaniel watched his son's laughter ring through the air, something inside him cracked. The custody hearing was set. Andrew had witnesses, legal experts, and a plan. Nathaniel had one thing more powerful than all of it, his son. But we needed something extra. That's when I had an idea. "We need to show the judge exactly how much you've changed," I told Nathaniel. "Let Theo tell them himself." Nathaniel hesitated. "What if I let him down?" "Then let him see that you're trying." For once, Nathaniel listened. The courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed as we entered. Nathaniel was the villain in the media's eyes. Andrew sat across from us, smug and composed. Nathaniel? He looked like a man preparing for war. Theo sat beside him, small but brave. Then, the judge banged the gavel, and the trial began. And I realized this wasn't just about Theo anymore. This was Nathaniel's last chance at redemption. Andrew's lawyer went first. "Mr. Cross has a long history of neglect. He has prioritized business over his own son's needs. Just last year, he attempted to send Theo away." Nathaniel flinched. They had evidence. "Theo requires stability. My client, Andrew Cross, has been more involved in the child's care." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. Then Theo grabbed his hand under the table. And everything changed. When it was our turn, Nathaniel stood. For once, there was no arrogance, no mask, just a father fighting for his son. "You're right," he admitted, voice steady. "I wasn't the father I should have been." Murmurs filled the courtroom. "But I am now." Then he turned to Theo. "Do you want to stay with me?" Theo nodded, gripping his hand tighter. "Yes." Andrew scoffed. "That's not a legal argument." But the judge was listening. And for the first time, Nathaniel Cross had won something money couldn't buy. His son's trust. Andrew wasn't done. He threw his last card on the table. "Nathaniel Cross cannot be trusted to care for Theo alone," he snapped. "He still relies on a waitress to raise his son." All eyes turned to me. Silence. Then Nathaniel stood. "You're right," he said again. "I can't do this alone. But I don't need to." His gaze locked onto mine. Because for the first time, I'm choosing the right people to stand beside me. The judge took a long pause before speaking. "The court finds that Mr. Nathaniel Cross has demonstrated significant growth. While concerns were initially raised regarding his ability to care for his son, the evidence provided today suggests a father willing to change." Andrew stiffened. The judge's next words sealed his fate. "Custody remains with Mr. Cross." A collective gasp. Nathaniel let out a breath and pulled Theo into his arms. For the first time in his life, he had won something that truly mattered. The days after the trial felt different. Nathaniel was different. He wasn't the cold billionaire anymore. He was Theo's dad. And me? I had planned to leave. But then, Nathaniel stopped me. "Stay." I frowned. "As what?" His lips curled into a smirk. "You tell me." That night, I watched as Nathaniel tucked Theo in. He read to him, smoothed his blanket, stayed beside him until he fell asleep. Then, as he turned to leave, he hesitated and whispered, "I love you, kid." Theo stirred, smiled in his sleep. Nathaniel exhaled. And in that moment, I knew Nathaniel Cross wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was finally a father.